let me tell you about what I read in January. I got my Jane Austen cup of coffee. So I read 3 1/3 books this January. I'm hoping to finish the 4th one in early February. I've timed it where I think I'll finish it the first week of February, hopefully by my 21st birthday. I have never read this much in January before. January is the month that's really hard for me to read. Even though I make resolutions, I get busy with school and work and other projects, and reading usually becomes my least priority, unfortunately. Most of my reading is done during the summers. But I'm a theater major and I'm minoring in English. And so the first week of school, 2 different classes of mine said, you have to read these novels. And I wasn't sure what to expect, but it made me read something new. So let me show you what those novels were. So the first book I read this year was actually my first John Steinbeck novel, and it was for my travel writing class. It is Travels with Charlie in Search of America. I was reading this in my beach reading vlog earlier this month. I'm not a nonfiction person. I used to love reading biographies on Revolutionary era presidents. I'm kind of tempted, though, to read more nonfiction after this, because I used to love nonfiction as a kid, and I just don't really in recent years. I think I love escapism. I don't know. This was my first ever travel writing novel I've ever read in my life. I didn't even know it was a genre until this past year. And it was also kind of a memoir, and I don't read memoirs. And it's interesting because I learned recently that apparently memoirs are the most popular form of book right now, which in my eyes, when I go to the bookstore, that's the first thing I pass. Memoirs typically don't captivate me because they don't leave a lot of room for creativity, or so I thought. Steinbeck proved me wrong. He grew up in Salinas, California, which I actually went there this past summer, which is crazy. I had not been to Northern California in almost a decade. And then I went this past summer to Monterey, Salinas, Mount Carmel, and that's where he's from, that area. And they had like statues of him, and I had never even read anything by him. This is one of his later books. He moved to New York, and he decided, I want to get to know America again. I'm going to take a road trip for several months. I'm going to drive all the way to Salinas, California from New York, and then I'm going to drive all the way back from the south. So he's just like doing this around the country. And he brought his dog, Charlie. And Charlie is amazing. Like, everyone in my class, we were all talking about this book. We're like, Charlie the poodle makes the book. He's just the best secondary character ever. And he's so funny, and we love the dog. Everyone loves the dog. It's so cool how Steinbeck makes this novel so interesting with him and a dog going around a country. Really, really, really good read. I would have never, ever, ever chosen this book. Like, I never would have chosen this book. I do think I like fiction more than nonfiction still, but this changed my mind and made me think that I might actually enjoy reading some more nonfiction books this year, because it proved to me that nonfiction can still be creative and it can still tell a really, really good story. So I'm gonna give this a 4 out of 5. Also, I've been told from people that you don't just hand out 5s that easily, and I feel like I have a hard time giving low ratings, so I'm going to be more objective. So I'm gonna give it a 4. It was really good though. Like I said, I'm a theater major, first and foremost. Although most people tell me you're a theater major when they meet me, they're always like, I thought you were an English major. Nobody believes I'm a theater major at first because I'm so introverted and I just give off English major vibes. Being a theater major, I read a lot of plays and I always felt like I didn't read a lot. But then I realized recently a lot of booktubers count plays as books they read, and I'm like, if I would have known that, I would have read like 30 books I would have read like 50 books last year because I have to read so many plays for school. And so this year, I'm counting plays. If other booktubers count plays, I'm gonna count plays because I've never counted plays before. I read The Tempest by William Shakespeare. This is my 4th Shakespeare play to have read. Don't tell my professors. I have seen As You Like It, and then I've read Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth. The basics. Probably a bad thing as a theater major to not be well read in Shakespeare, but I haven't taken any Shakespeare classes, so. The Tempest. I honestly went into this book thinking it was a tragedy, because Shakespeare, if you don't know, he writes tragedies, comedies, and history plays. And I went into this thinking it was going to be a tragedy, and it's a comedy, because the rule with comedies is if it ends with a wedding, it's a comedy. That's the rule. That's the rule in theater. Like pretty much all theater across the board. If it ends with the wedding, it's comedy. That's the secret of theater. So if you're watching a play and it doesn't end with some mention of a wedding, might be watching a tragedy. Yeah, so spoiler alert, this is a comedy, so you have an idea of what probably happens at the end then. But I was also really surprised because I was wondering while reading this if The Little Mermaid took inspiration from it, because we have Ariel, who is the air spirit and goes by he, so that's different than The Little Mermaid. But there's also an evil Sebastian character, but he's not like the main bad guy. The main bad guy... There's actually several bad guys. The premise of The Tempest, for those that are like, I'm never gonna read Shakespeare, or give me the lowdown but don't spoil it. I'll give you the lowdown, but I won't spoil it. Basically, Prospero, he's this Duke of Milan, and he has this daughter named Miranda, and his brother is like, I want to be Duke of Milan. So he conspires with King Alonso of Naples, and he's like, hey dude, let's get rid of my brothers. So they send his brother, Prospero, and Miranda, his little baby daughter, on this boat 12 years ago. I think she was like 3 at the time, so she's like 15 in the book. They send them on this boat with like no food, no sail, no mast. They're like, yeah, they're pretty much gonna die on the ocean. And then this one man named Gonzalo, who's part of the king's court, he's friends with Prospero, and he's like, I'm gonna give you like books and clothing and food, and like wish you the best. And then he ends up crashing on an island with all the supplies, and Prospero raises Miranda on the island. Prospero has magic powers, by the way. I forgot to mention this. That's like the exposition of the book. But 12 years later, Miranda's 15 now, Prospero finds out Alonso and his brother are on this boat with all these like people from the king's court coming back from a wedding back to Naples, passing by this island. Prospero uses his magic powers to make them crash on the island, and his goal is to get the king's son, Ferdinand, to marry his daughter, Miranda, so that way she can become Queen of Naples. And he'll be like, I'm Duke again, my daughter's a queen, and I'm going back. I think my favorite is Hamlet. Hamlet's my favorite Shakespeare play. I actually don't think I can rank all the Shakespeare plays I've read, but I do know Hamlet's my favorite. I've read Hamlet like 3 or 4 times, and it's the longest Shakespeare play, so for me to have read it 3 or 4 times means I actually like it. I think I'm gonna give it like a 3 out of 5, but I thought for like a Shakespeare play, it wasn't boring. I've heard there's some pretty boring ones out there from what I've heard, and I thought this one was like pretty good. Like I was kind of like invested, but I wouldn't say it's my favorite, but I'm glad I read it. I'm glad I read it. The third book I read this month was Vicious by V.E. Schwab. I had been wanting to read this for a really long time because I love sci-fi and I love superheroes. I love superheroes, if you can tell. I don't know if you can see on my shelf, but I have like an Iron Man and Spider-Man comic. I have the Infinity War soundtrack that I got at the Marvel Symphony in Hollywood on vinyl. But I love superheroes. And also, I'm writing a book about superheroes, but it's like my whole goal with the book is to make it different from every superhero medium I've consumed. And so I told myself I could not read this until I finished writing the first draft of my novel. And then I was really worried, like, what if I read this and it's like just like what I imagined? And it wasn't. It was like different. It's so different. And it's really interesting to see how people can interpret superheroes in different ways. And this was very dark. This was really dark. But it was very well written. This book is really dark. I'm going to just preface that. It is vicious. It is vicious. So just look at the trigger warnings and look at what's in it. Nothing like romantically explicit. There's just like graphic violence, but also certain dark themes. The science fiction side of the book was really well thought out. So the 2 main characters make this theory. They're these science students in school, and they think that superheroes might exist. It's not actually public knowledge if it's possible. They call them extraordinaries. They're not sure if they exist, but they think, hey, what if it's possible to become an extraordinary by ourselves scientifically? So they run these tests on each other and both themselves in different ways and come back to life with powers, but their powers, I don't want to spoil it. I'm not going to actually say anything. I'm not going to spoil it. But the way they get their powers, certain characters get really dark powers. I love superheroes, and I don't shy away necessarily from dark topics. I love Daredevil. Daredevil is a TVMA show, Marvel, really good, probably my favorite Marvel show. I watched like a lot of Marvel shows, and Daredevil is my favorite, like even more than WandaVision, and I love WandaVision. It's a very dark show. It's very violent, but it has hope. And I think this book does not have hope. It has a little bit. It has a good ending. Don't get me wrong, the main characters are well written, but they're dark, twisted people. The best way I could describe the two main characters' complex, because they're like a hero and villain, but then the point of the story is like, are either of them really heroes and villains, or are they just two screwed up people with powers? The way I would describe it is like the main character is a villain. He's the villain. I describe him as a mix between Silco and Tony Stark, but he looks like Draco Malfoy. That's how I would describe him. But he has like this rivalry with the other character. I would say he reminds me of like Steve Rogers if he was evil. That's how I would describe them. It's like Tony Stark meets Silco, looks like Draco Malfoy, versus evil Steve Rogers. That's how I read them. Like, evil Steve Rogers is the hero. But I'm going to give this like a 3.5. Like I said, I'm trying to be more critical in my ratings because last year some people said I was giving too many high ratings. I really enjoyed reading it. It was a really good book, but I don't think I'd read it again, if that makes sense. I love found family, and I will say thank you, Schwab, for giving me found family in this book. That was like my favorite part of the book. And the last book that I've been reading, which I'll probably make a more in-depth video about next week because I'm hoping I'll be done with it by next weekend, is The Count of Monte Cristo, which I started it at the beginning of the year and took like a 2-week break to read all these books, 3-week break. And now I'm back at it, this far into it. I really like this book so far. I'm not gonna read it yet. I'm not gonna talk about it yet because I'm doing a video where I'm reading this and you get to like hear me ramble about it at parts. It's the abridged version, but it's still probably the longest book I've read in a really long time. This is one of the only classic books that has made me laugh out loud. I have laughed out loud so many times reading this book, which honestly shocked me because I love reading classics. And I feel like the only classic books that really make me laugh are Jane Austen. This made me laugh a lot. So here's to hoping it ends well. Thank you so much for watching and happy February. My birthday is in 4 days. Also, I'll be in the recording studio today because this is coming out on Saturday. So look forward to a new song too.